morning to all of you, and welcome to today's the second session of our 7-day lecture series on understanding Palestine. My name is Dr. Shubhda Chaudhary, and I'm the editor of Center for India West Asia Dialogue. Today, as we are talking about Palestine, let me give you the recent number of deaths and what exactly is the level of mayhem that has been caused. More than 13,300 people are dead, in which there are 5,600 children, 3,550 women, 201 medical doctors, nurses, paramedics, 22 civil defense crews, and 62 journalists as of now. So it's a very difficult situation, and it is very difficult to contextualize it and try to understand and locate it with the history of it when there's actually a genocide going on. But today, I'm really very thankful that we have an eminent speaker who has really been very, very helpful in even my previous attempts as a journalist in writing many of the aspects of US foreign policy. He has really assisted me. So on behalf of the Center for India West Asia Dialogue, I would like to welcome Professor Scott Lucas, who is a professor of international politics at Clinton Institute, University College Dublin. Now, you need to understand where is Dublin so that you'll also understand that why he's the best person to give this kind of voice or narrative, or even the entire the topic for today's discussion, which is Palestine, which is a chessboard, a pawn in the international chessboard. And he has been Professor Emeritus of International Politics at the University of Birmingham and the founder of and editor-in-chief of EA WorldView, which is a leading site for coverage of international affairs. He's a specialist in US and British foreign policy. And what I really liked when I have interacted with him in the past is that most of the analysts and most of the academics or journalists will give you a perspective of what exactly is happening in that time and space. But Professor Scott has been able to be a visionary and also predict or do a certain kind of scenario building on what would be the repercussion of what is happening right now, which I really have learned a lot from him. He began his career as a journalist in US and wrote for leading UK newspapers and magazines before he founded EA WorldView in November 2008. He's a political analyst and international radio international radio and TV channels, including the BBC, the Canada's CBC, Ireland's RTE, France 24, Deutsche Welle, Al Jazeera English and Arabic, Poland's TVP World, China's CGTN, Pakistan's PTV World, and outlets throughout India. Today, he was also talking at WION. I hope all of you know what WION is. You watch it also. So with this, I would like to not take much of the time and hand over it to Professor Scott Lucas. And he'll be comfortable if, for example, when he's speaking something, you have a question or a critique, so you can write in the chat box and he will converse with you. We have 35 minutes for him to speak. Then it will be followed by question answer. But if in case in the meanwhile, while he's speaking, you also have a question, you can write down in the chat box. So yes, Professor Scott, thank you so much.
Dr. Chaudhary, thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me to this fabulous place where you're talking about dialogue, which is one of my favorite words. I like dialogue rather than war or conflict or division as a starting point for when we discuss these issues. And thank just all of you who have come in to have a chat. And for me, this is just a chat. And so at any point, if you have a question or you have a comment, you don't have to wait for question and answer. You can put it up in the box and I'll try to work it into what I'm talking about. But I'll also try to keep it to like 30 minutes because I want to find out what you think. I want to find out your perspectives. I'll tell you just a little bit about me because I'm a big believer you should always know where someone starts from in terms of perspective. So as Dr. Chaudhary said, I'm I'm kind of lucky in that I get to be an academic and I enjoy being an academic. I've worked in the UK and now in Ireland for my career, but I've also been associated with universities in other parts of the world, including Lebanon in the Middle East and Iran, which is an interesting experience I'm happy to talk about. But I'm also a journalist. I've put the Clinton Institute's link up at the top of the chat box because that also is linked to a new initiative called the CNN Academy, which is, yes, that CNN, the one that started in America. So we're working with students to train them in terms of being both academics and journalists. It's a professional program as well. And you can find out about the CNN Academy through the Clinton Institute website. I've also put the EA WorldView website up, which does have coverage of international affairs, including the Middle East. So there should be my latest interviews, including with Weon, which are posted there if you want to get a further perspective of where I'm coming from, or if you want to contribute yourself, because we do take submissions from writers. We're a volunteer, we're a nonprofit, all volunteer site. And I also get to be a political analyst, which is great because I get to learn about all these different countries where I'm interviewing. I'm interviewing with the TV and radio outlets because I think, Dr. Chowdhury, the big thing that, and you were so kind in your introduction, but the big shift for me going back to journalism and then starting EA WorldView is not just to look at this from the standpoint of what does Washington think, or what does London think, or what does Moscow or Beijing think. It's to start from the ground up. It's to what's happening on the ground in terms of people's hopes, their aspirations, their ambitions, too often their fears and their concerns, which has very much influenced my approach now in all of those areas as academic journalist, as analyst, and it will influence the way that I chat with you today. So what I wanted to do is I'm going to start off with a question of whether Palestine is simply just a pawn, and Palestinians, by extension, they're just a pawn for other states and for other groups to sort of try to seek advantage from that. And I'll explain what I mean with that in just a bit. But before I get to that, I'm going to start off with Area 1. And the outline is in the chat box. So please, hopefully, I'll keep myself organized. But if you want to check off, it'll be there. Area 1 is, and I'm going to be an initial approach, and I'm going to start with this, and it may not sound academic. It simply is the sanctity of life. And I'm going to say this on the basis of not only studying Israel and Palestine ever since I was doing my university degree in the 1980s, especially over the course of the last, what is now 6 weeks, since October the 7th. And that is that my starting point is that the life of each and every civilian, each and every person, wherever they're located, whether that's in Israel, whether that's in Palestine, whether that's in Lebanon, whether that is in another place in the Middle East, that life is sacred. It should be sacred. The opportunity should be given for people to live in security and in safety for themselves, their families, their children. You should provide opportunity for those folks. These are basic philosophical, moral, ethical points of view. But when we get to a point where the sanctity of life is not being respected, this is not an either or good versus evil situation in the sense that there have lives that were lost in Israel on October the 7th, 2023, more than 1,200 of them. And there are lives, the death toll unfortunately has now been elevated to more than 15,000, but it's going to be far higher than that in Gaza because there are bodies buried under the rubble. Those lives have been lost since October the 7th. And I'm happy to talk about the current situation, but as an analyst, what's been difficult for me over the past few weeks is that in the short term, I think more lives will be lost. I do not think we're at a point where we're going to get a ceasefire, let alone a long-term a settlement where two states, Palestine and Israel, can exist together with civilians in each of those states being provided with safety, security, and opportunity. That's just a personal view, and I'm happy to discuss it further, but you need to know that as my starting point. Area 2. So if I'm working on this as an academic, but also as a journalist, as an analyst, what has struck me is always the question of Why are we not at a point where we have two states, where we have hopefully security and stability and safety for people within those two states? And I know a lot of people talk about two-state solution, one-state solution, but I wanted to sort of break that down in my own head. And this is what I came up with. State organization and what's called an international constituency. And I'll start off with point A under area 2, which is what struck me as when the Jewish people who had suffered a genocide in World War II, and there's a lot of talk of what genocide is. We can discuss what it is in 2023. This was a genocide in the 1930s and during World War II. When the Jewish people went beyond calling for a homeland and calling for a state, they were able to obtain a state in 1948. And that's a date, of course, which is very close to 1947, which is very important for India. Israel and Israelis, like India and Indians, albeit after a very difficult period of partition, they have the leverage of being a state. They have the leverage of being in international organizations or international discussions. Palestinians do not have the leverage of a state. They do not even, for decades, have the leverage of an organization that is what you might call a proto-state. Think about the Palestinian Liberation Organization that was finally came about in the 1960s, or think about later on. Thank you for putting that up, Dr. Chowdhury, the WhatsApp group for Understanding Palestine, which I'll be joining later on today. Palestinians do not have, even when the PLO is created in 60s, really that type of widespread reach, because many other states, other groups don't recognize the PLO. They don't recognize them as a legitimate actor for negotiation. Think about all the discussion of terrorism in the 1960s, 1970s. So Palestinians do not have representation. And they're already, hundreds of thousands of them have been displaced in 1948. Many of them, of course, are winding up in Lebanon, winding up in Jordan, winding up in Egypt. And they don't have the leverage of an international constituency. Now, I'm going to put out a trigger warning here. This is not a conspiracy theory that Jews run the world. This is not a conspiracy theory that Jews control international finance or international media, because guess what? They don't. I'm not going there. However, because of the nature of what happened with the genocide, the Holocaust in World War II, and because of the nature of Judaism, in which well before World War II, Judaism, at least elements of Zionism, which I know you heard about yesterday, were linked to the quest to return to a homeland. There was an international constituency which associated Judaism with the return to Israel. There was not the same type of international constituency which said that for many Muslims, for many people who are ethnically Arab, there should be a homeland, a state called Palestine. Instead, the constituencies tended to be associated with individual states, many of which that had been created in the 20th century or recreated in the 20th century. So there's a constituency for Egypt, for Syria, for Lebanon, for Iraq. There is a constituency that talks about pan-Arabism, especially in the period of Nasser in Egypt. There's a constituency that talks about the notion of the non-aligned movement, which includes not only, of course, Arab states, but includes India. There's not a constituency for Palestinians for a state of Palestine. That's B. And C, there is not yet a catalyst for Palestine to achieve this. There could have been, and I'll explain that in a minute, but there's not yet of it. And to explain what I mean by that type of catalyst for Palestine to achieve this, let me give you three analogies, one of which is very close to home, I suspect, for you all. There was a movement amongst many people who are Muslim, not all of them were Muslims, but many people who lived in Kosovo to have an independent Kosovo. What you needed was the catalyst which came out of the breakup of the Soviet bloc and therefore the breakup of Yugoslavia. But in the case of Kosovo, you also needed the further catalyst, which was the conflict with Serbia, which did include elements, as it did in Bosnia, of ethnic cleansing. And therefore, with NATO's intervention in 1999 against Serbia, there is a catalyst which says, well, wait a minute, maybe Kosovo should become independent. Maybe it should be a state. Now, that still is not resolved even to today. I was talking about this with another outlet yesterday about Serbia and Kosovo, but Kosovo is at least autonomous now. If you think about the question of Kurdistan, and again, the Kurdish movement is in Iraq, in Iran, in Syria, in Turkey. What you needed for an Iraqi Kurdistan, which is to an extent autonomous, it's not yet an international state, but you needed both the calamity of the 1991 Gulf War, where Saddam Hussein went in and wiped out Kurds after he was able to hold on to power, and then you needed the catalyst of 2003 when Saddam was forced out of power. In Syria, you actually have Kurdish autonomy in northeast Syria. Syria is no longer one country, it's actually three different countries, a topic for another lecture. But in the northeast, you could argue there is effectively a Kurdish proto-state, which is there. And that, of course, came out of the catalyst of 2011, the mass rising against the Assad regime. And then, of course, with the case of Kashmir, which you all probably know far better than I do, there is not yet the catalyst, and may not be the catalyst, where you get, as it were, an autonomous or an independent Kashmir, because you still have issues as whether this is Indian territory, whether this is Pakistani territory, what should the status be? We're in a sort of, and forgive me for saying this, a bit of limbo over that issue. There was, by the way, a potential in 2002 that this could have changed. But you probably know that episode better than I do. I'll just leave that hanging there for a moment. So if Palestine doesn't have, well, let's go to the historical background to flesh this out. Area 3, the historical background. So I could go back centuries. My dad's a preacher. He's a Protestant preacher. He has been to Israel several times. And when he came back from Israel as a boy, he would tell me about how in Jerusalem, this is the center of three faiths. This is the center of Christianity, which was our faith. What was called the Dome on the Rock, which is where Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac, and God told him not to. That would be a bad thing to do, and Isaac could live, which is good. But it also forms the basis for what becomes a Jewish narrative of Judaism, but it also becomes the basis of a Christian narrative if you take the whole lineage through not just Old Testament, but New Testament. But of course, it's the center of Islam, or one of the centers of Islam, with the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And of course, the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque are the same place. That's the Golden Dome that you'll see in the photographs on top of Temple Mount. So you have one space that is sacred for three religions. You have one area, a space, whether you call it Palestine or Israel, where you have, in general, two different groups of people who would like to live there, who would like to have this as the basis for their homeland, and you're trying to fit two into one when it comes to 47, 48. The catalyst for the birth of Israel is the British economic crisis of 1947. Now, this is relatively boring, but the most significant event in world history arguably would have been that the world suffered its worst winter. Climate change is still an issue today. In 1947, the world's worst winter winter of the century, because the British could no longer afford to have more than a 3-day working week. And if they couldn't have more than a 3-day working week, they couldn't generate revenues to keep the government going. And if they couldn't keep the government going, they had to liquidate assets. And sorry for reducing India to an asset, but that's what happened, is that India was able, in part, just in part, to get independence because the British couldn't afford to carry the financial responsibilities anymore. Same thing happened with Palestine, as well as, of course, the fact that there was a Jewish insurgency that was, taking British military lives and civilian lives. and it was growing more powerful. And what you have is, of course, the birth of Israel. Here's your state, but you have the dispersal of Palestinians, the Nakba. And there's hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who are the ancestors of almost 6 million Palestinians who are still stateless today. Many of them still in refugee camps, or what you might call refugee communities, because in some cases the camps are effectively now big housing complexes, right? That unequal outcome, one group gets a state, the other group gets scattered, is reinforced by the Six-Day War. Oh, sorry, actually, I should say something about 47, 48. Quite often people represent this as Israel is responsible for the dispersal of the Palestinians, which they are, but they leave out a key part of the story. It would have been possible in 1948 to create a state of Palestine. There was before the 1948 war, the Arab-Israeli War, where Israel defeated the Arab states and established the state. The UN, going through the British mandate, had created Israeli territory and Palestinian territory. Why wasn't there, even after Israel defeated the Arab states, there's still elements that Israel does not control? Well, the decision is to give the modern day West Bank, which is the West Bank of the Jordan River, to what becomes the new state of Transjordan. In other words, Transjordan, which was on the east side of the Jordan River, has the West Bank as well, which is why it becomes Jordan as a country, confirmed in 1951. Gaza goes to Egypt. So there was a decision by Arab states as well as the international community. There would be no place for Palestinians, which was their place. The 1967 war reinforced that, because of what happened is that when the Israelis again defeat Arab states, they then take over the effective control of both the West Bank and Gaza. So they take over the West Bank from Jordan, and honestly, Jordan's quite happy with that for reasons I can go into. They take it over from Egypt. Egypt's not happy with that because they've been humiliated by Israel. But to be honest with you, the Egyptians never have had a space where they thought, we'll reclaim Gaza. For example, when they reach the peace accord, the Camp David Accords with Israel in 1979. So now you have Israel in control of both Gaza and the West Bank, including the Palestinians who live there. You have Palestinians who are in Lebanon, which in the 1970s, 1980s is in a state of civil war. You have Palestinians who are in Jordan, which despite giving up the West Bank is still a very unstable area in terms of internal turmoil. And you have Palestinians who live in other states, other Arab states in lesser numbers. You don't have them, by the way, however, in Saudi Arabia, which is an important story in itself that we'll get to. There is a window of possibility between 1988 and 2000. And by a window of possibility, you might know something called the Intifada, the resistance. That resistance, which is not just simply the PLO, this is simply Palestinians themselves in the occupied territories who are challenging the Israeli military, leads to Israel thinking, maybe we need to have a discussion here. Maybe this is too unstable for our own security. And there is a recognition by the international community beginning in 1988. There are some states that have recognized it before then, going back to the 70s. In fact, I'm trying to think, but I think the first state that recognized the PLO, or one of the first states that recognized the PLO in 1974 was India. By 1988, many states are recognizing the PLO. So now they're legitimate. They're a legitimate place for the negotiations. And these are the negotiations that lead up to the Oslo handshake, which is, of course, first you have the agreement in Oslo, and then Bill Clinton, following that agreement, which was 1992 and 1993, Yitzhak Rabin, the Israeli prime minister, shakes hands with Yasser Arafat, the leader of the PLO. And those negotiations go through 2000. And they fail to reach an agreement in Camp David, which is in Maryland, in the final months of the Clinton administration. That was the window to get the two-state solution. I can explain, if you want me to ask, I can tell you why 2000 failed. The reason why I highlight that is when the new administration, the American administration comes in, the Bush administration, they have no interest in really pursuing an Arab-Israeli settlement, or sorry, Palestinian-Israeli settlement. And there's a little event called 9/11 that completely remakes the world in the eyes of the Bush administration and indeed of many countries. So the Israeli-Palestinian settlement is not a priority for most countries, except arguably for Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, and this is something to highlight, in 2002 comes up with the Arab Peace Initiative. Now, the Arab Peace Initiative is effectively, again, because of the catalyst, which is everybody pretty much knows. The Saudis know because the Americans have told them, we're going to attack Iraq and we're going to knock Saddam Hussein out of power. And for the Saudis, it is, all right, a lot of people are going to be upset that Saddam Hussein's out of power, even if the Americans established control in Iraq, which they didn't. So if we're going to let the Americans go in, if we accept the Americans going in to attack Iraq, at the same time, we want a settlement on Israel and Palestine. But Iraq didn't go well. It didn't lead to a stable Iraq. And so instead of being able to focus on Israel and Palestine, you've got a mess in Iraq. In 2006, 2007, there's really a shutting down of legitimacy in the space for Israel and Palestine. Legitimacy is shut down because after Hamas does win elections in 2006, they then fight an internal war with the other main Palestinian party called Fatah, F-A-T-A-H. Hamas wins that, but because Hamas does not recognize the state of Israel, the Israelis slapped the blockade on Gaza in 2007. The Israelis had left in 2005. They don't want the burden of being in Gaza anymore, but they don't want Hamas threatening them, so they're going to blockade the place. They're going to trap 2.3 million Gazans, or what will become 2.3 million Gazans. They're going to trap them in that territory until Hamas is no longer in power. At the same time, you think, well, maybe the Palestinian Authority. Now, this was created in 1994. This was to be the government that could be the government of Palestine. It is recognized by the United Nations as the outlet for Palestine. But the Palestinian Authority has lost in Gaza. They now are in the West Bank, but a lot of people in the West Bank don't like them either, because the Palestinian Authority is seen as being, I'm going to use a very polite word, economically challenged, which means a lot of money goes missing that should go to Palestinians rather than to the elite. They don't provide services that are needed on a day-to-day basis. And they don't seem to have the ability to reach any type of settlement leading towards the two-state solution. So who are your leaders? Who are your government who speaks for Palestinians by the time we get to 2007, even when there's a short-lived American attempt, which was the last significant attempt to get a U.S. Israel-Palestine settlement in 2009, which was in the first year of the Obama administration, led by a man named George Mitchell. Why is that important? Because against all odds, the Americans had been able to broker a settlement to end decades of violence in Northern Ireland. At the end of the 1990s, the man who led that effort was George Mitchell. I'm going to go for about another 10 minutes, if that's appropriate, Dr. Chowdhury. Yeah, I just want to make sure we leave enough time. So I want to go through a series of frameworks. As I said, at the end of the day, I'm talking about whether or not Palestine is a pawn. And I'm going to say something which is going to be a little bit strange, which is that I think it is not the case that the U.S. has always been an unreserved supporter of Israel, which prevented the U.S. from maybe treating Palestine as more than a pawn. Now, that might sound strange because the stereotype is that the U.S. has always been on the side of Israel and will always be on the side of Israel. Before 1967, the United States actually was not that close to Israel. The Soviet Union, by the way, was the first country to recognize Israel, not the Americans, right? Because the Soviets wanted them on their side in 1948 in the Cold War. The Americans have a lot of strategic interest in Egypt. They tried to get close to Nasser for a number of years. They have a very big strategic interest in Saudi Arabia. oil, arms sales, geographic position. 1967 changed that, in that the United States had to make a choice between the Arab world and Israel. And for strategic reasons, the American play is we're going to keep Saudi Arabia as a strategic partner, while at the same time we have Israel as a strategic partner and we have Iran as a strategic partner. When the Americans lost Iran in 1979 to the Islamic Revolution, it became even more important to have Israel as a strategic partner. But remember, part of having Israel as a strategic partner was trying to get some type of stability, in this case with Arab states, and this was the Israel-Egypt peace settlement, Camp David. And then you hopefully are going to get in Israel-Syria or Israel-Jordan first, then Israel-Syria peace settlements. Now, Palestine's still not in the framework, right? But from 1988, it does become in the framework. Because in the American eyes, and this is especially the Bush administration, Big Bush, George H.W. Bush, unless you get some type of resolution of the Israel-Palestine ongoing dispute, you're not going to get Israel and Arab states who are going to be able to reach settlements. That is what, because they had failed. There was an attempt by the Americans to get an Israel-Syria settlement in 1990, 1991, 1992. It didn't come off. So then you think maybe we need to get Palestine resolved, and that's where you get Oslo from. And that's why the Clinton administration pursues it. And I have a lot of problems with how the Clinton administration pursued the Israel-Palestine negotiations, but they did genuinely try to pursue it. Palestine was not simply a pawn here. Because the idea is, unless you have Palestine as a recognized actor, a recognized state, other Arab states are not going to reach a state of stability with Israel. And the Obama administration had the same viewpoint in 2009. Now, they were undercut by a lot of other American groups and by the US Congress, and they were undercut by other international actors, but they did genuinely want Palestine to be a state. The problem since 2009 was not that the Americans bailed out on Palestine, it's that the Israeli government, led by Benjamin Netanyahu, had no interest in a two-state solution, and also some other countries we're going to get to in a minute. And of course, the fact that American foreign policy just was completely chaotic once a guy named Donald Trump went into the White House. But I don't like talking about him very much, so I'll skip that part real quick. Europe as an entity has also developed relations with Israel. They're tense. They're quite often tense, but I'm talking not only about individual European states. You will have noticed in the current crisis that the Germans are very close to Israel, for example, and you can think about the historic reasons why that has come about. I found out from working on Polish TV that the Polish political culture is very close to Israel. You could talk about the European Union, however, that is saying, all right, we need to work with Israel, but not just simply to back Israel. The European Union has also been part of the quartet. That's the US, Russia, the UN, and the EU, which nominally is there to try to get some type of stability between Israel and Palestine. So the European Union, if you want to go Europe at large, does have an interest in trying to get a Palestine which is a state. They just don't have much leverage. Because this brings me to where we start to get to some interesting parts. The Russian Middle East strategy is to simply get leverage wherever they can, because from the 1990s, especially under Vladimir Putin, the attempt has been to rebuild Russia as an international player, a geopolitical force. Russia had lost a lot of its position in the Middle East with the fall of the Soviet Union. But if you want to talk about the catalyst for the current Russian position, it was supporting the Assad regime in Syria. That was the re-entry of Russia into the Middle East in a big way. Here's the interesting point. The Palestinians were expendable for that, because the Russian priority when they backed the Assad regime was to develop a working relationship with the Israelis. Benjamin Netanyahu met Vladimir Putin on several occasions, and the agreement was Russia could have a military position in Syria if Israel had freedom of action to attack the Iranians in Syria, and if Israel had freedom of action on the Palestine question. And Russia made that bargain. The Chinese have generally kept their heads down because Israel-Palestine, from the Chinese perspective, has been a loser. If you take either side in this dispute, you're just going to get dragged in. And if you watch, part of the reason why the Chinese build themselves up is they don't go on the front foot when you have a conflict. India-Pakistan's a little bit different. I can talk about that because I know it may be close to you. But generally, the Chinese will not get involved in international conflicts because they don't want to put what we call skin in the game, right? Now, that may change in the current situation. China has started to make initiatives, especially in the past week, where they were very supportive of Arab states, not Palestine, but of Arab states and their position over Gaza. So I think China may use Palestine as a pawn to get closer relations with the Saudis, for example, and possibly with the Egyptians. India, what does India do? India has got economic interest in developing links with Israel. They've got technological links or interest in technological links with Israel. The current Indian government, which has been in power for some time, was in a complicated position here because they really want to build up that relationship with Israel. And to be honest with you, Palestine is an inconvenience. Now, I know that the Indian government talks a lot about values, and I understand that. But in this case, the Indian government, if they talk too much about values and talk too much about Palestinians, risked unsettling their relationship with Israel. And that's why in the initial phase of this conflict, whereas the Indian government was quite silent, the loudest Indian voices tended to be on social media, and they tended to be pro-Israeli, sometimes very pro-Israeli. And again, there's other reasons that you'll probably be able to guess why that happened, which we can discuss if you want to. The Indian government is still remaining relatively muted on the issue of Israel and Palestine, although Indian media coverage, at least with the outlets I work with, is shifting. And that is the Indian media I tend to work with. And there are certain outlets, I'm not talking about one particular outlet that I won't work with in India, and I won't name it, but they are over the top in being, let's say, very argumentative. But if you talk about other interviews, say with CNN 18, with WION News, with India Today, the scale of the civilian death in Gaza has unsettled the Indian media. It has been unsettling. At least that's my reading of what's happening. Let me talk, and I am overrunning a bit, so I'm going to get through this fairly quickly. But the Arab states are where I get really interested in this. Because with rare exceptions like 2002 and the Arab Peace Initiative, the Arab states use Palestine as a pawn. The Arab states really are not that invested in a Palestinian state per se. They seek it as leverage with their domestic audiences and for their regional position. So, for example, when Saudi Arabia wanted to maneuver with other Arab states and to get fellow capitalist states, they would tend to take a harder line against the Israelis. Expanding the Arab states to include Turkey, President Erdogan, whenever he wants to build himself up as a leader within his own country, which is in serious economic difficulties right now, and when Erdogan wants to portray himself as a leader of the Muslim world, he takes a harder line against Israel, which is precisely what he has done, not on October 7th, but about 2 weeks later when he shifted position. If you talk, for example, about Jordan, they just want everything to be quiet. Just be quiet, because any instability threatens Jordan internally. If you look at Lebanese factions apart from Hezbollah, they just want everything to be quiet because Lebanon is in horrific difficulties right now, and they have a large Palestinian community. Iraq, at certain points, Saddam Hussein would play up the Palestinian cause to try to build himself up as a leader in the region. Egypt has built up the Palestinian cause at certain points when Nasser wanted to be seen as a leader of pan-Arabism, and then later on Anwar Sadat. But generally, Arab states, their interest is how can we get political capital out of using Palestine. Which leads me to my final provocative group, which is the so-called axis of resistance. The axis of resistance, which is a term coined largely by the Iranian regime since 1979, is because, in the words of a friend of mine, an analyst, a fellow analyst, Iran will fight to the last Palestinian against the state of Israel. Not for the Palestinians, but to the last Palestinians. Palestinians are expendable. The Iranian regime, who is the major backer of Hamas and the major backer of the Islamic Jihad, see those groups as being able to unsettle, to destabilize Iran, or destabilize Israel, I should say. Which is why the Iranians in general were hoping that something would happen before October 7th, 2023, to disrupt Israel getting close to Saudi Arabia. Normalization. What happened on October 7th, 2023, which unsettled Iran, is they didn't expect Hamas to go in and kill a lot of civilians. All of a sudden, Iran, the major backer of Hamas, faced international backlash because Hamas had gone too far, which is why Iran immediately said, we've got nothing to do with this, but we're glad Hamas did this. We've got nothing to do with this, but we're glad Hamas do this, which is the same thing that they're saying 6 weeks later. The axis of resistance, Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, possibly Palestine Islamic Jihad, they talk a big game. The issue here is whether the axis of resistance can use Palestine to get favor in other parts of the Arab, Muslim world, and even the international community. But no, the Iranian regime has no interest, as it were, from the ground up about a two-state solution. I'm going to go through this very quickly because we've got now about 45 minutes and I'd like to reserve it for discussion. I'm going to give you a couple of really provocative points. One is what happened on October 7th, 2023 that changed the situation as Hamas crossed a line. This was the fifth cycle of violence between Hamas and Israel. 2008, which was one of the reasons why EA WorldView became EA WorldView. It was the first international conflict that we covered on a day-to-day basis. We had only established ourselves a month earlier, and it taught us, don't look at this from the standpoint of Washington or Moscow or Beijing, look at it from the standpoint of what's happening in Gaza and in Israel. 2008, 2014, 2018, 2021, and now. But Hamas crossed a line because they didn't just fire rockets into Israel. They didn't just kill Israeli military personnel when they crossed the border. They carried out mass killings of Israeli nationals, Israeli civilians, and foreign nationals. That was something the Israeli political culture had never experienced before. They had not experienced it not only from Hamas, they had not experienced it to this degree from an Arab state since the state of Israel was created in 1948. But Hamas crossed a line not only with Israel, they crossed a line with the international community. Much of the international community, not all of it, but for much of the international community, Hamas can no longer be a legitimate government, a legitimate authority, because you will not have stability or security while Hamas is in power. But from October the 8th, 2003, the Israeli leadership they obliterated the line. They wiped it out. The Israeli leadership will use the rationalization of that, we're justified in killing Hamas's leaders because of what they did to civilians. But what they have done is they have broken international law flagrantly, because in a built-up area like Gaza with 2.3 million civilians, you can't get to Hamas leaders without killing a lot of civilians. And the Israelis have deliberately, and this is the key word, deliberately struck refugee camps, shelters, schools, mosques, hospitals, and other sites that are protected under international law. I'm not going to go too far on this because I get really wrought up about this, because it has been one of the things that has shaken me as an analyst more than anything else. And I've covered this for decades, right? The last time I was this shaken by mass killing was in one day, August 20th, 2013, when 1,400 Syrians were killed within hours by a nerve agent attack launched by the Assad regime. Because what you realize, and I've used this line in my media interviews, for the Israeli leadership, and indeed for Hamas, civilians and hostages are expendable. They are expendable. And at that point, it's not just that Palestine is a pawn on the international chessboard. A Palestinian life has no value, or a Gazan life has no value at this point. So what happens now? Look, not just as an analyst, a journalist, not just as, but as an activist, you try to limit the damage and the loss of life. We may, and I emphasize, we may be close to a deal in which up to 50 hostages, there are 240 hostages, up to 50 of them may be released in exchange for a 5-day pause. I'm still not convinced it's going to happen, because I'm not convinced Netanyahu will accept it, but we may be close to it. If there is that pause, then we will have the prospect that you could then have another pause and a pause after that, or you could extend the pause. That is what the international community, that's what the Americans are hoping for, the Europeans. I suspect it's what the Indian government is hoping for, is that you start off with this pause and you then expand it. You cannot call it a ceasefire to start off with, because the Israelis will not tolerate that. But if a humanitarian pause is extended across weeks and then months, in effect, it becomes a ceasefire, if you follow where I'm going with this. Secondly, you recognize illegitimacy. And I'll say something provocative. I've said it in my media interviews. We are not going to get anywhere regarding Israel and Palestine unless two things happen at almost the same time. Hamas is removed as the effective leadership in Palestine through political and economic means, not through military means. And Benjamin Netanyahu is removed as prime minister in Israel. It does raise the question of whether you get an Israeli leader who will ever be like Yitzhak Rabin in the 1990s, who would countenance a two-state solution. But as a starting point, Netanyahu's got to go and Hamas has got to go. And then is the big question is trying to get back to legitimacy. And here, you've almost got to get back to ground up. You have to be honest about a starting point, which is a two-state approach. But you have to be honest that Israel society and Israel politics has to rebuild from the ground up. Israel swung so far to the right, I'm not sure that could happen. But then you have to be honest about Palestine. There is not a legitimate political authority, not just with Hamas. I don't see the Palestinian Authority as being legitimate right now because they're discredited. So which Palestinian groups can you work with to provide health, education, housing, reconstruction? Who do you work with in Palestine? That's the cutting edge question, which will start with international aid. This is why the humanitarian pause must have large-scale international aid on a sustained basis, because then you begin to detach civilians from Hamas as their protector. You give them an alternative. And then you have to be honest over self-interest. Every country, every group will still have a self-interest. It doesn't mean they make Palestinians their number one priority, but you have to say to those states and those countries, a two-state solution where all civilians have security and stability and opportunity is in your interest as well. Because you will suffer economically or politically if this type of conflict goes on again and again and again. And that applies to the US, it applies to Israel, it applies to China, it applies to Saudi Arabia. But there I might sound a bit utopian, because I've been hoping we could get to that point for a long time. And we have suffered a serious setback over the course of the last 6 weeks. Overran a bit, my apology, Dr. Chowdhury, but
Okay.
I also then will go to the comments as well, and I will pick up on that